Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. This week, we're going to discuss what I call panic moves. I'll explain what that is when we get to the game. But first, let's go to our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
As a reminder, all listeners are welcome to email me if you have any comments on the show, or even better, a suggestion for a topic idea or a question for me. There's no Patreon, there's no membership, there's no requirement. Anyone who listens and enjoys the podcast is welcome to email me. It's info@thechessangle.com. And as always, my usual disclaimer, I can't promise that your question will be read on the air. If it's something I feel I'm not qualified to talk about or not comfortable discussing, or if it doesn't quite fit the vibe of the show, I might pass on it, but I will definitely look at everything that comes my way. Once again, info@thechessangle.com. Our first email is from Everett. He writes, Neal, love the podcast, as so many do. It's a joy to have something perfectly suited to an interest of mine to listen to during the day when I have downtime. What are your thoughts on amateur players and the hyper-modern style of play? I've recently taken to playing the ready as white, knight f3, and I found it to be very instructive to play. I'm in the 1000 to 1100 range. I know basically everyone will tell amateurs to stick to classical chess principles, which completely makes sense. However, after playing the ready recently, I have found that my knowledge of attacking squares and not just enemy pieces has increased substantially, relative to what it was, of course, and my positional play is improved. Certainly, everyone should learn, employ, and gain a solid understanding of classical chess principles before doing anything else, but I wanted to share how the ready and hypermodern chess ideas have been a boon to my understanding of the game. Thanks, Neal. Everett from Alabama. P.S. I also wanted to give a small shout out to I.M. Silman's work. Both his books and chess.com modules are treasures to me, and he is very missed. Well, very interesting email. Thanks so much, Everett. So let's take those sort of in reverse order. Yeah, Silman's books are great. You also mentioned his chess.com modules. Those are awesome too. Many people may not be aware. I remember them from the Chess Mentor CD-ROM days. Before it was on chess.com, those lesson modules were, like I said, on a CD-ROM set called Chess Mentor. I used to get them through the mail. So those have been around a while. Some of the Silman modules, which are lessons again now on chess.com, include Roots of Positional Understanding, Silman Teaches Tactics, and Silman's Lessons in Strategy Parts 1 and 2. All that stuff is great, so I agree with you completely. Second thing, regarding the hypermodern approach, I think that's fine even for your rating range. I know that traditionally, the really sort of old guard, old school coaches are like, learn open games first, learn E4 and E5 first. And yes, you have to know those structures, but the hypermodern approach is absolutely fine. Now, for those who may not be aware, when we say hypermodern, those are the ideas of ready, as we mentioned, in Nimzovich. It's the idea that you can control the center with pieces rather than pawns or in addition to pawns. So something like D4 and then knight f6, the Indian defense, that would be a hypermodern approach because you're controlling a square with a piece rather than a pawn. The modern defense is another example. After e4, black plays g6 to fiend Keto. So you allow that formation by white, but then you seek to attack it and break it down. So the hypermodern approach is absolutely valid. And if you understand those openings, like you say, and you enjoy playing them, then do it. For me, my entire defense against 1d4 is hypermodern. I play the Nimzo and Queen's Indian defenses. You're fighting for the e4 square from a distance with pieces. It often involves me playing knight f6 and then b6 and bishop b7. That's sort of a Queens or Nimzo idea, but that's absolutely hypermodern. I've had a lot of success with it. I think the more important point there, Everett, is you even said that it's increasing your knowledge in positional play. So if you're having success with it, I would absolutely do it. I mean, yes, you need to be familiar with the E4, E5 structures and the sort of traditional way of playing. But if it's working for you, I would stick with it. I don't see any issue. So thanks so much for your email. Best of luck with your chess. Our next email is from Aaron from Minnesota. He writes, "Love the pod. Thank you for doing it. Former teacher turned computer guy, new to the game, playing the London and the French defense, struggling with visualizing chess notation while reading and listening to the episodes. For example, I can quote-unquote see the square C3, and I can see a knight on C3, but I struggle to see that square connected to the other squares and the board. For example, when I see the square C3, it would take me a while to tell you what other squares are surrounding C3, and this becomes a bigger problem when I'm trying to move that knight to a new square or visualize other pieces." And he puts the word move in quotes. He's talking about in his head, of course. Then he says, "I recognize that some of this will clear up with repetition, but I'm wondering, are there best practices for learning visualizing notation? Are there clever teaching devices people are using to visually move through the board, like mnemonics, songs, rhymes, associations, and other teaching tools? Would love to hear you speak about this on an episode if it fits. Thanks again, Aaron." I don't know if I can do a whole episode on this, but I'm definitely going to address it now. So thanks so much for your email, Aaron. Now, first of all, very, very important, as you said up front, you are new to the game. So you need to give it time. You don't want to be premature and beat yourself up about your visualization skills. It will come. Now, as far as those clever teaching devices like mnemonics, things like that, I don't know if I'm the right guy to talk about that. I'm not really a big fan of that sort of hokey pokey type of stuff, like those visualization exercises where you say, you place a knight on an empty board and then you visualize the squares it goes to. Like you put the knight on the board, you stare at it, you close your eyes, and then you name all the squares that the knight attacks, things like that. I don't know, maybe those things do work. Maybe people will fight me on that. I never really got into that. For me, it just came with experience and playing and studying. And as far as stuff like that, I'm really not an expert on what's out there and those types of exercises. That's really all I can tell you. What's ultimately going to help, again, is experience, studying the game, and working on your calculation and analysis. Again, you're a new player, so this is going to take time. And at your level, you definitely want to focus on all your basic tactical patterns. Those tactical puzzles will help your visualization. Absolutely. Now, I know I mentioned in a previous episode that with those tactical puzzles, I was criticizing them because they're offense only, because a lot of the times it involves a mate or a sacrifice. You're thinking about your plans because you know up front it's a tactical puzzle. You have to understand, I was just pointing out the flaws in those that you need to be aware of and study in other areas. You still need to do those puzzles though, right? I mean, those tactical puzzles are very, very important because you need to know all of the basic tactical elements. In other words, pins, forks, skewers, removal of the guard, overloaded piece, all that stuff. Working on those ideas, that's definitely going to help your visualization. But again, as far as specific mnemonics and rhymes and things like that, I'm not really the best person to speak about that because I never really got into that. For me, it just came through experience playing, analyzing games, all that stuff. But thanks for your email, Aaron. Really appreciate it, and best of luck with your chess. Now let's get to the meat of this week's episode, which is all about panic moves. So what I call a panic move is where you have a critical position or a tricky position, or maybe your opponent made a strong move that threw you off. And as the name implies, you start to panic. And as a result, you play an unnecessary defensive move or you think the position or his move is much worse for you than it is. And rather than really analyze and taking your time, you essentially panic. Now, panicking doesn't mean necessarily that you whip a move out right away, but it just means that you get frustrated and you don't analyze and you sort of convince yourself that there's no way out of it. And then you just deteriorate from there. So for this game, I'm putting my ego aside. This was an ugly game. This was not a good outing for me. I did not play well. I mean, I'm putting the PGN for you to see, so everyone who looks at this can see how poorly I played. But remember, everyone's going to have a bad night. And if I only show my good games and games where I played well for this podcast, I mean, that's kind of cheesy. If I don't show some of my painful losses, like I said, that's really kind of lame, and it lowers the integrity of the podcast. So I am going to show some of my uglier games because they are instructive. I'm going to learn from them. And this is a good example of panic moves. My opponent was 1899, call it 1900. Very strong tactical player, likes to mix things up. But as you'll see, a lot of the reasons he was able to get tactical and mix it up is because I just missed some fundamentally sound moves that I should have played. And of course, against a player like that, as soon as you start slipping up once or twice, they're really going to pounce on it. So not my best outing. So like I said, I'm putting my ego aside. We're going to look at this game. If you want to put it in an engine, again, the PGN is there. For those of you new to these game analysis episodes, you don't really need to follow the position in your head. It's not like I go move by move. What I'm doing is discussing the game as if we were sitting in a restaurant having lunch or at a Starbucks having coffee. Like if you said, "Oh, Neal, how'd your game go last night?" And I would just kind of tell you about it. That's what it is. So it's really, what are the takeaways from this game? What did I learn from this game? What are moves that I should have made where I should know better with my experience? Things like that. So let's learn from it. That's really what it's about. Let's extract the most instruction that we can. So this game started out as a Queen's Indian defense, which I like playing as black. It's one of my standard openings against D4 along with the Nimzo Indian, but you can also use it against other openings that white plays, or if he plays D4 and then he does some kind of sideline thing, the Queen's Indian still works very well. It works well against the London. It works well against a lot of other things. In this particular game, it was actually a book Queen's Indian defense. It was a main line. So we were in book for a good, 10, 12 moves, something like that. And the first takeaway from this game, and interestingly enough, this is something that Heisman mentions in the book I reviewed last week. The first mistake I made was that I did not develop a piece, and instead I played a move that controlled the square, but it completely wasn't necessary because the piece I had on that square already wasn't being attacked or anything. So my knight was still on B8. I should have gone knight D7. I should have developed it, but instead I played F5. I played this pawn move to add to control of a square and defend a piece when it wasn't necessary. So that's one thing. If you can play a developing move before another move that you want to play, but it's not immediately necessary, you should do that. And the reason I mentioned that, the fact that I didn't develop this knight, that really led to me falling apart for the rest of the game. All right, so that's the first thing. If you have a choice between a developing move and another move that you want to play, but there's no need to play it yet, play the developing move. And it's amazing how even stronger and experienced players mess that up. So that was the first takeaway. And then what happened was, and this is where we get to panic moves, or we're almost getting to our panic moves. He played this knight move that really kind of threw me off. It's a strong move. He placed his knight where I can take it with a pawn, but the problem is, for tactical reasons, it doesn't matter if you don't have the position in front of you. I'll just say thematically, when he made this knight move, I can't take it with the pawn because of tactical reasons. It opens up a rook on my queen, and then he attacks another piece. Strong move. It's not like he's winning or anything, but it's a tricky move. And my knight still isn't developed. Now, if my knight had been on D7, if it were developed already, this position would be completely different. So me missing one developing move essentially changed the trajectory of the whole game. And I actually slowly fell apart from here. And here's the sad thing also, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this. I had about 2 or 3 other chances to still develop this knight, but I mistakenly thought that I needed to play other things, and I really didn't. So this was just poor analysis on my part. Maybe it was a bad night. I'm not going to make excuses, but it's amazing how when you look at it at home, you're like, why didn't I do that? Why, who knows? It's just tournament conditions. It's just a completely different thing. But anyway, not developing this piece caused me problems. And that's a major problem in general, is failure to develop. Because then while you're trying to develop, your opponent gets an initiative and slowly squeezes you. So then we get to the first point in the game where I made my first panic move. Now, despite me not being ready for his surprise knight move, I'm actually okay here. According to the engine, white is like 0.89, which is, not much. I mean, that's pretty much even at our level. So I'm doing okay, but to his credit, he's kind of mixing up the position. It's a little bit odd. And he made this knight move that threatened to go to a square. And the problem was, I thought if the knight goes to that square, it was going to be a problem for me, and it wasn't. And as a result, I played a weakening pawn move. I moved a pawn in front of my king. I played g6, which, again, sometimes moving those kingside pawns is correct. In this case, it wasn't. And then it allowed him to then attack my kingside, because you have to remember, every time you move one of your castling pawns, it has the potential to weaken your king position. I mean, technically, it does weaken your kingside position. It really depends on if he can attack it. But the problem was, I totally did not need to worry about this knight h5 move. So I made a panic move. I thought, oh boy, if he goes knight h5, this is going to be problems for me. And I was completely wrong. And that's how you get into trouble. So I should have analyzed more, and I should have hit in the center, but I played this g6 move. Not a blunder, but it's definitely sort of a question mark exclamation point. Like, it's not the best idea. Still basically okay, but it wasn't the best idea. So that was panic move number 1. And then, because I played g6, he then played h4, which might sound like it's correct, attacking my king side, but it really doesn't do anything. And here, I redeemed myself. Here I played the best move. I played e5, and I hit in the center. And again, that's another theme. If your opponent attacks on the wing, you want to hit in the center, which is what I did. So I played e5, not too hard to see. So I'm basically back in it now. His lead is now a little bit diminished. So despite the panic move, I was okay, but I was still feeling a little bit insecure right now. So I hit in the center. He moves his knight back. I'm doing okay now. So now I have some space in the center. I then centralize my rook. He then moves his rook over to h1. So what we have here, we have my central play with his kingside attack. Now, usually central play often beats a kingside attack, but not always. It really depends, obviously, on the moves and who has the initiative. I thought I was okay here, but then I made another panic move, because the issue was I was trying to figure out the best way to play in the center, and all I needed to do was bring my knight more towards the center, because my b8 knight ended up developing to a6, which at the time was correct. But you know the old saying, a knight on the rim is dim. So all I had to do here was just go knight c7, get my knight back into the game. I can then move it to the center or even the king side. But instead, I made my second panic move. I did this pawn push, which is a bit of an inaccuracy. So it wasn't the best idea. I simply needed to move my knight again. And it goes back to what I said earlier. You want to play a move that you sort of have to play before you play one that you want to. And I messed that up twice here. I mean, I'm hanging in there now. He's definitely better. It's not like he's completely winning or resignable, but my position's a little thorny here. And then we get to panic move number 3. He then pushes his h-pawn. He's going for a full-blown attack on my king. And in these critical positions, you really, really need to hunker down and think. But it's always easy to say that at home. In the actual tournament hall, it's tricky because he has this attack now. I'm looking at responses, and everything I'm coming up with seems to be not working. So what I did was I traded pawns in the center, thinking that was the best idea, and it wasn't. Because what happened was, and again, this was poor analysis, whenever you trade pawns or move pawns, you always need to look at how that affects your pawn structure when everything comes out in the wash. And I played this move where I took a pawn, and then I end up with a very weak, isolated pawn on d6, and then he gets an open file. So in other words, by me playing in the center, I did it the wrong way. And so now he has a kingside attack and his pieces are better in the center. So I'm going from bad to worse here, but that's what often happens when you play these panic moves. So we make some trades in the center, and now he's up like plus 2.30, something like that. I mean, he's completely winning here. I thought I could hold it, but the problem is he now has a kingside attack. His pieces are very active. He has control of the center. My d6 pawn is weak and isolated, so it's ugly right now. So I'm trying to sort of salvage this as best I can. And this was one of those positions where it was very, very hard to know what to do because everything I came up with, he had a response for it. But of course, when you have an attack and your pieces are better and your opponent has a weak pawn, it's very easy to come up with a correct plan. And yet again, I should have brought my knight over. Instead, I moved my rook to protect g6, but that wasn't correct. I mean, this is one of those moves where when you look at it on the computer, they make it seem so easy to defend against it. But when you're sitting there in a tournament, it's very, very tricky. I moved my rook up to protect not only the isolated pawn, but g6. That was wrong. I should have just moved my knight again. And then basically he comes crashing in. It's just completely ugly at this point. The H file is open now. His knight on f4 is beautiful. It's attacking all sorts of squares. I have like zero counterplay. He's up almost 3.0. It says like plus 2.57. And a player who's 1900, that's a pretty big advantage. I'm still trying to do the best I can, but this is what happens. When you keep defending over and over and over, it just gets to a point where I don't want to say I gave up. That's not what happened. I wouldn't do that. But it was so hard. When you're facing an attack, sometimes it's so hard to come up with the right plan. I mean, I was taking my time. I was trying, but there was nothing here. Like I'm a strong enough player that I knew I was completely losing here. And I was looking for a way to mix it up or swindle, but there was nothing because his position was just so dominant. And then I basically fell apart. I ended up resigning after about 29 moves. Not my best night. A lot of the initiative that he had could have been prevented if I had simply developed better. And if I had played moves that were sort of required, like required developing moves instead of moves that I sort of wanted to do. I should know that at this level. I normally don't make that mistake, but that's the thing with tournament chess and with over the board is we're going to sometimes forget the fundamentals, or very simply, we're just going to have a bad night. But I wanted to show this game just to discuss how panic moves work. And when your opponent makes a move that seems like a bit of a surprise, you really got to take your time. Don't panic. Look for a solution. Develop your pieces. And that's the way to get through it. But I didn't do that here. I made about 3 panic moves. It happens. Ugly game, but instructive game. When you look at this is a lesson in how not to play and how I sort of neglected fundamentals for other moves that really didn't need to be played. And if I had done that correctly from the beginning, he wouldn't have had this attack and this initiative. And that's the thing with good players. If you fail to develop properly, they are going to take advantage of that. Now, if I were playing a low-rated player, I could probably get away with some of this, but against the stronger players of the club, you're not going to get away with this. Now, I've also been on the other side of this. I mean, this is interesting. I've also played higher-rated players where they kind of made these sort of panic moves and these kinds of mistakes. I've played, players, let's say 2000, 2100, who would mess up the fundamentals. It happens. It happens. It's like Silman has said and others have said, anyone under 2200, anyone who's not titled is capable of playing very poorly on any given night. I think that's from The Amateur's Mind. It's from one of Silman's books. So if you want to look at it, if you want to look at this ugly game, that was a very embarrassing loss for me. The PGN is there. But like I said, it's instructive. As far as those panic moves, it's really 2 things. When your opponent hits you with a surprise, or if he has an attack and you're getting frustrated on how to defend, you can't panic. You need to analyze, look at concrete lines, and you need to remember that those necessary developing moves, you have to play those first before the moves you want to play. And that'll prevent you from getting into trouble. Because I basically made it easy for him because of how poorly I played. And interestingly, even after the first couple of panic moves, I was actually still okay because he made a few inaccuracies. It really wasn't until towards the end, about 3/4 of the way through the game, where I completely fell apart and where I resigned. I mean, it was messy. I probably could have resigned even 5 moves earlier. It's what it is. So this is the game. Check it out if you want. And again, the moral of the story is don't panic. So anyhow, hope this was helpful. Really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.